Please subscribe to Big Billy Media Productions and share. This enables me to bring you the content that I enjoy bringing to you. Please subscribe to Big Billy Media Productions and share. Thank you. The air was crisp and biting as the four of us stood on the docks of Halifax, Nova Scotia. We were staring up at the RMS Atlantic Queen. It was November 1938, and the grand ocean liner loomed like a giant steel masterpiece against the gray sky. Its black hull cut a stark line against the choppy waters of the Atlantic. The ship was a marvel, really. Over 1,000 feet of luxury and power, the pride of the Cunard Line. It ferried the elite and hopeful between continents. We weren't elite, mind you. Just a ragtag group of friends. Me, Evelyn, Thomas, and Clara. We had scraped together every penny for a chance to start over in England after the Depression had chewed up our lives and spat us out. Evelyn clutched her coat tight, her auburn hair whipping in the wind. "She's beautiful, isn't she?" she murmured. Her voice was almost lost in the clamor of the porters and passengers. I nodded, but something about the ship unsettled me. Maybe it was the way the fog curled around its funnels, like ghostly fingers reaching down from the heavens. Or maybe it was the faint hum I thought I heard. Not the engines, but something lower. Something different. Thomas, ever the skeptic, clapped me on the shoulder. "Don't look so glum. 5 days on the finest ship afloat, and then a new life. What's to worry about?" His grin was wide, but his eyes darted to the water, where the waves lapped against the dock with an uneasy rhythm. Clara was quiet as always. She said nothing. She just stared at the ship, her pale hands twisting on the strap of her suitcase. We boarded that afternoon, our third-class tickets clutched in our hands like lifelines. The Atlantic Queen was a floating palace, polished wood, gleaming brass, chandeliers that sparkled like stars. But as we descended to our cramped cabin on D-deck, the opulence faded. The walls were plain, the air stale, and that hum, it was louder down here. It vibrated through the metal floor. That first night, we laughed over dinner in the third-class dining room, the clatter of plates drowning out that hum. Evelyn teased Thomas about his seasickness, and Clara sketched passengers on a napkin. For a moment, it felt like an adventure. Later, as I lay in my bunk, that hum grew in pulse. A slow, deliberate thump, like a heartbeat beneath the ship. I told myself it was the engines. I mean, it had to be the engines, right? The next morning, the Atlantic stretched out endless and gray beyond the portholes. I met Thomas and Evelyn for breakfast, but Clara wasn't there. "She's still sleeping," Evelyn said, buttering a roll. "Said she didn't feel right last night," Thomas smirked. "Probably just the waves. She'll toughen up." Evelyn's face grew serious, her dark eyes focused. "I heard something," she whispered, glancing over her shoulder. Something in the walls. What kind of something? I asked, trying to keep my tone light. She hesitated, then leaned in, voices low, like they were arguing, and footsteps, soft ones, pacing outside our cabin door. But when I looked, the corridor was empty. Thomas frowned. It's an old ship, Evelyn. Pipes groan, floors creak. You're imagining things. Evelyn shook her head. It wasn't pipes. It was words. I couldn't make them out, but they were angry for sure. That afternoon, we explored the ship to shake off the unease. The grand staircase on A deck was a sight, marble and gold. Passengers in furs and suits gliding past like they belonged to another world. But the higher we went, the more I noticed the crew. They moved quickly, their faces tight, their eyes avoiding ours. One stood, a wiry man with a scar on his cheek, dropped a tray when Thomas asked him about the ship's history. Nothing to tell, he snapped, gathering the shattered glass. She's a ship. She sails. That night, I couldn't sleep. The hum was louder, a steady thump, thump, thump that seemed to crawl up my spine. I slipped out of the cabin, leaving Thomas snoring, and I wandered the corridor. The lights flickered, casting long shadows that stretched and twisted like living things. Then I heard it, a faint whisper, just beyond the next corner. "Help us," it said, soft and desperate. I froze. Help us. I rounded the corner, but there was nothing. Just an empty passageway. The hum, though, pulsing, louder. When I got back to the cabin, Clara was awake, sitting up in her bunk. "You heard it too," she said. Her voice trembled. It wasn't a question. Help us. By the third day, a thick fog had swallowed the Atlantic Queen. The ship's horn blared every few minutes, a mournful wail that echoed through the mist. Passengers stayed inside, their chatter subdued. Evelyn tried to lift our spirits with a game of cards in the lounge, but Clara was distracted in thought. "I saw something," she said, her voice barely audible over the horn. "Last night, in the mirror." Thomas's eyes rolled. "What now? A ghost brushing its hair?" Clara glared at him. "It was a face, not mine. A woman's, pale and wet, like she'd been underwater. She was staring at me. Her mouth moved, but there was no sound." Evelyn set down her cards. "Clara, you're scaring yourself. It was a dream." But Clara's hands shook as she spoke. And I remembered the whisper I'd heard in the corridor. "Help us. Help us." That afternoon, I went to the ship's library, A small room on B deck lined with leather-bound books. I wanted answers. Something about the Atlantic Queen's past. The librarian, an older woman with sharp eyes, watched me as I flipped through a logbook. "Looking for ghost stories?" she asked, her tone dry. I forced a laugh. "Just curious." She leaned closer. "Curiosity's dangerous on a ship like this. She's seen things. Wars, storms, worse. Things that don't leave." I found nothing concrete, but her words stuck with me. That evening the fog thickened, and the ship slowed to a crawl. The hum, if you can call it that, was unbearable now. A deep, guttural throb that rattled the walls, it seemed. Thomas finally admitted he heard it too. "It's not right," he muttered, pacing our cabin. "It's like something's alive down there." Evelyn snapped at him to stop, but her voice cracked. Then came the knock. 3 sharp raps on our cabin door, just past midnight. We all froze. Thomas ran and yanked it open, but the corridor was empty, except for a puddle of water glistening on the floor. "What the hell?" he breathed. Clara whimpered, pulling her blanket tighter. "It's them," she said. "They're here." On the 4th day, the fog had not lifted, and the Atlantic Queen felt like a tomb adrift on the sea. Passengers whispered about delays, about strange noises in the night. The crew avoided questions, their faces pale and drawn. I couldn't stand it anymore. I needed to know what was happening. Against Evelyn's protests, I convinced Thomas and the girls to come with me. "We'll check out the lower decks," I said. "See if that hum is the engines or something else." Clara suggested we just wait it out, but Thomas shrugged. "Better than sitting here and waiting for ghosts." We descended past D-deck, down narrow metal stairs that creaked under our weight. The air grew colder, damp, and that hum so loud it buzzed in my teeth. On F-deck, the lights were dim, flickering like dying stars. The corridors were a maze of pipes hissing and shadows shifting. Then we saw it, a door, rusted and unmarked, half hidden behind a stack of crates. The hum was definitely coming from there. Thomas pushed the door open, revealing a dark stairwell leading down into the ship's belly. Water dripped from the ceiling, pooling on the steps. "This isn't right," I said, my voice echoing. "Crew only, maybe?" Thomas smirked. But it didn't reach his eyes. "You scared?" Before I could answer, we heard it. A scream, faint and muffled, rising from below. We stared at each other, hearts pounding. "That's not machinery," Clara whispered. The scream came again, sharper, followed by a low, guttural laugh. It made my skin crawl. I grabbed Evelyn's arm. "We need to get back." But as we turned, the door slammed shut behind us, the sound ringing like a gunshot. And in the silence that followed, the hum stopped, replaced by footsteps, slow and deliberate, climbing the stairs towards us from the dark. The footsteps echoed up the rusted stairwell, slow and deliberate, each one a hammer against my chest. The four of us stood frozen, the slammed door behind us cold and foreboding. The scream we'd heard had faded, but the laugh, low, guttural, inhuman, still hung in the air. The flickering light from the corridor barely reached into the darkness below, and the damp air smelled of salt and rot. "Move," Thomas hissed, shoving at the door. It wouldn't budge. The footsteps grew louder, closer, the sound of wet boots slapping metal. I grabbed Evelyn's arm. "We can't stay here." She nodded, her bravado gone, and we stumbled down the stairs, away from the door, and toward whatever was coming. The stairwell descended deep, deep, deep into the ship's belly, and the hum, it returned now, louder than ever. A pulsing heartbeat. It shook the walls. At the bottom we found a chamber. Low ceiling, its walls slick with moisture. Pipes snaked overhead, dripping icy water onto the floor. And there, in the center, was a hatch, its edges rusted, sealed tight with bolts. The footsteps stopped. The hum stopped. The silence returned, pressing in, thick and suffocating. Then the hatch creaked, a slow, grinding sound, like something was pushing from the other side. Clara swore under her breath, backing away. "We need to get out," she said, her voice trembling. But before we could move, the air shifted. Cold, sharp, carrying a whisper. "You shouldn't be here," it said, clear as a bell. I spun around, searching the shadows, but there was nothing. Just us, the hatch, and that voice. "You shouldn't be here." We bolted back up the stairs, our footsteps clanging in the narrow space. The door, the top, was still shut, but Thomas threw his shoulder against it, and it gave way with a groan. We spilled into the corridor, slamming the door behind us, hearts racing. racing. The hum returned, pulsing, and the ship felt different, alive, watching. "What the hell was that?" Thomas demanded, wiping sweat from his brow. I shook my head. "I don't know, but I'm not going back to find out." Back in the cabin, it was night. We sat staring at one another, our faces pale in disbelief. "What do you suppose that was down there?" Evelyn snapped, her voice sharp with worry. Clara just stared, her eyes wide, clutching her sketchbook. "We heard it," she whispered. "The screaming down below." Thomas shot me a look, but I kept my mouth shut. "It's nothing," I said. "Just the ship settling." I lied. That lie didn't last an hour. The foghorn blared again, and the lights flickered out. Darkness swallowed the cabin, broken only by the faint glow from the porthole. Evelyn lit a match, her hands shaking. "This isn't normal," she said. 4 days in this fog. It's not right." Clara pointed at the porthole. "Look." We crowded around. In the mist, over the ocean, shapes moved. Vague, human-like figures, drifting just beyond the glass. They weren't reflections. They weren't crew. One pressed closer, its face blurred out, but unmistakably pale, and eyes hollow. Evelyn dropped the match, plunging us back into darkness. "What are they?" she breathed. Clara's voice was barely audible. "The ones who didn't leave." The lights sputtered back on, and the shapes were gone. But the air felt heavier, and the hum now a low growl. Thomas grabbed his coat. "I'm finding the captain. Someone's got to know what's happening." Evelyn tried to stop him, but he was out the door before any of us could. Thomas didn't come back for hours. We waited, the tension coiling tighter with every minute. Evelyn paced, muttering about storms and mechanical failures, while Clara sketched furiously. Page after page of pale faces, wet hair, hollow eyes. "They're trapped," she said, her pencil scratching. "Down there, in the ship." I wanted to argue, but the memory of that hatch, that voice, stopped me. When Thomas finally returned, he looked like he'd aged a decade. His coat was damp, his eyes wild. "The captain wouldn't see me," he said, slumping against the wall. "But I talked to a steward, the scared one. He told me to stop asking questions. Said the Atlantic Queen's got secrets in her bones, and we're better off not knowing." Evelyn grabbed his arm. "What secrets?" Thomas hesitated, then lowered his voice. People go missing. Every voyage. Crew, passengers, doesn't matter. They just vanish. A chill ran through me. I thought of the scream, the footsteps, the shapes in the fog. And the hum? I asked. Thomas swallowed hard. He wouldn't say, but he looked at me like I'd already seen too much. Clara dropped her sketchbook. It's not just missing, she said. They're still here. I can feel them. That night, we retired to our bunks in exhaustion, only to be startled by the ship suddenly stopping. It was a hard and immediate lurch, so violent that it threw us against our bunks. Dishes shattered in the dining room above. Passengers screamed. The horn blared long and desperate, and the hum rose to a roar, shaking the walls. Evelyn clutched my hand. What's happening? Before I could answer, a voice crackled over the intercom. All passengers, remain in your cabins. This is not a drill. The ship steadied, but the hum didn't stop. It was a howl now, reverberating through every deck. We ignored the intercom. Staying put felt like waiting to die. Armed with a flashlight from Thomas's bag, we crept into the corridor. It was chaos. Passengers huddled in doorways. Crew shouting orders. The air was thick with salt and something metallic. It tasted like blood. We made our way to the lower decks again, drawn by that sound. On E-deck, we found a scared crewman, his hands trembling as he barred a door. Get back, he yelled. You don't know what's down there. Thomas shoved past him, and we followed. The door led to a cargo hold. The same door, crates stacked high against it, the floor sick and slick with seawater. And there, down the stairs, in the center, was the hatch, the same hatch from before. Its bolts gone, the lid open, a dark, deep liquid under the surface. We turned to a splashing and sloshing sound behind us and saw another open hatch. A gurgle came from it, like a human gasping for air with a mouthful of water. Evelyn screamed. A face slowly surfaced, gurgling what sounded like, "Still here. Still here." The crewmen slammed the hatch shut. Other crewmen appeared and began closing and locking several hatches in the area. The crewman rasped, "They've been waiting since 36. The storm. The ones we couldn't save." sank to his knees, muttering prayers. Clara whispered, "I think they're free now." Sullen and numb, we turned to leave. Then the floor hatches burst open, water gushing out and flooding the hold. Shadows moved in the waves, dozens, hundreds, reaching for us, grabbing. We ran fast. We ran knowing the ship was going to break apart at any moment. The fog lifted at dawn, and the ocean liner RMS Atlantic Prince was boarding those of us lucky enough to have made it to the lifeboats. We survived, and so did the Atlantic Queen. Although it had been towed to port, apparently the ship was never the same. Neither were we. The hum was gone, and the shadows silent. Yet sometimes, in the dark, I hear them, still, whispering, still here. Still here. Please subscribe to Big Billy Media Productions and share. This enables me to bring you the content that I enjoy bringing to you. Please subscribe to Big Billy Media Productions and share. Thank you.